National correspondent our Damon is standing by for us in Istanbul, Turkey. CNN contributor and former Moscow bureau chief Jill Doherty joins us from Seattle, Washington. And here in LA, retired U.S. Army Major General Mark McCarley is with us also. Welcome to you all. General McCarley, the president made it clear with that tweet that there's a strike coming. He didn't say when, but he said the missiles are coming. Some are concerned that the tweet telegraphs U.S. action. The administration clearly wants to send a message to Bashar al-Assad. Listen to Secretary Mattis. Listen to what he had to say.
The Syrian regime should think long and hard before it again acts so recklessly in violation of international law against the use of chemical weapons.
General McCarley, my question is a simple one. What would a short, limited strike actually achieve?
Well, as we look at the strikes, I think the first thing that's got to be addressed is the fact that the president, in his tweets, got ahead of his planners. So he has basically written or inscribed his own red line. And he has put himself in a position where he has essentially committed himself to go forward with this airstrike. And as we've talked previously, the real question is this just a one-off that, like a year and 4 days ago, when the president launched that strike against Al-Shayat airfield, and the net result of that strike, a couple of MiGs were destroyed, and 24 hours later, the airfield was back in operation. We all felt good about the outcomes, but the net result, based upon maintaining a sense of compliance by the Assad regime with international norms and laws, didn't happen. So this could be, once again, a replication of everything that we saw last year.
All right. Okay, General McCarley, we thank you. Our Damon there in Istanbul. General McCarley making the point that it could have very little impact if it is indeed a short, sharp strike. As you speak to people there in the region, as you speak to Syrians in and outside the country, what is the view of possible military action and what it would achieve?
I think, the overarching hope, I guess, if there even is that much hope left, is that there would be some sort of long-term strategy that is attached to all of this, because it also is going to depend on what kind of targets are taken out, and if they are taken out to the degree that would then stop the kind of aerial bombardment that we have been seeing happening in those rebel-held areas, whether it's attacks carried out by the Syrian regime or by the Russians. People on the ground are very, very apprehensive at this stage as well, because their main concern, and understandably, is what is going to happen after these strikes take place, assuming that they do. How is the Syrian regime going to retaliate? Who are they realistically going to go after? Who are the Russians going to go after? Who are the Iranians going to go after? The most vulnerable and, I guess, soft target on the ground right now in Syria is, in fact, the Syrian population in these rebel-held areas. So is there any sort of plan in place to try to prevent airstrikes from happening against them? Does the U.S. and its various different allies plan on trying to protect the civilian population? Is this going to go so far as to perhaps impose or see some sort of semi-de facto no-fly zone being put into place, which, remember, is something that the Syrian opposition had been calling for since day one? There's also a lot of confusion, broadly speaking, as to what is the U.S. strategy in all of this. People at the end of the day really feel as if they are, and in fact they are, pawns in this broader political global game of chess, where the individuals who are moving those pieces around on the board, quite frankly, don't care that much about the fate of those who end up dying because of their actions.
Our Damon making it very clear that the feeling on the ground there. Awa, thank you. Stand by for us. I want to go to Jill. Jill, you heard what Awa was saying there, that people fear that they're basically being used as pawns in a geopolitical battle. One front, obviously, is the tensions, the battle between the U.S. and Russia. Listen to what the White House Press Secretary Sarah Sanders had to say about Russia on Wednesday.
Russia has proven themselves to be responsible in part for this. They guaranteed that the use of chemical weapons by Syria would not happen again. They failed at that. They've also helped enable Syria by vetoing 6 different UN resolutions that have helped protect Assad. So they certainly hold some responsibility in this, and certainly have proven themselves to be bad actors in this process.
Jill, the question is, as we take in the risks associated with possible military action, the unintended consequences, is what would Russia do in the event of a U.S. military, a U.S., UK, France, an allied coalition military strike, if you will? What would Russia's response be?
You know, it seems to be pretty clear what they would do if their own people were hit. General Gerasimov, the chief of staff of the military, has said that they would respond, that they would shoot down missiles, they would shoot down the carriers for those missiles if Russian troops were attacked. Now, if obviously the Syrians, in, let's say, a pinprick strike, were hit, then it's a little less clear how would they respond, even would they respond. But I think it's important, you know, they do have S-400 air defenses, which they could turn on at any minute. They could certainly respond that way. They could use some electronic warfare to retaliate against American, planes or any types of missiles. But would they? And I think, you know, one thing to remember is that Syria for Russia continues to be kind of a testing ground for many of their new weapons, and the more sophisticated weapons has really been kind of an advertisement for the Russian military. So they cannot show themselves weak. That certainly is true. And then also you have remember the general was talking about the strike last year, where they actually did tip off the Russians that something would be coming. This time the geopolitical relationship, is extremely bad and very different. And, all you have to do is note the comments coming from the White House, very critical of, certainly of Russia, and beginning to be critical of President Putin, although that doesn't come out quite as much. But that's a different scenario. So any warning, would the U.S. do it now, this year? Not clear. It's a very increasingly bad relationship, and this is highly dangerous. You've got the Russians, you've got the Kurds, you've got the Iranians, Syrians, etc. It is not just one side against the other. It is multiple sides.
Yeah, a good point as you lay out all the different actors in this battlefield, if you will. General McCarley, as Jill was laying out how Russia could respond if there were to be strikes, do you have concerns for safety of American forces there in Syria? We know there's some 2,000 U.S. troops in northern Syria.
Well, as a soldier, albeit retired, the absolute right answer to that, the moral answer is absolutely, because those soldiers, American soldiers, are at risk. And to follow up on the previous answer, it is my belief, speculative, but my belief that the Russians will coordinate closely with the Syrians in any air defense type of activity. So if we launch, I think it can be expected that Russian equipment, not necessarily S-400s, but other anti-aircraft, anti-missile systems that the Russians have installed at several bases in Syria will be employed to shoot down whether our cruise missiles, or if we launch what we call standoff weapons, perhaps any aircraft that actually found itself close to the Syrian border. So there is a real threat with respect to our participation in this action at the same point in time when the Russians are such stalwart allies of the Syrians. And I just wanted to say one additional thought. As General Mattis, and you introduced this program with General Mattis suggesting that all options are on the table, recognizing that one of those options could indeed be a combination of diplomacy and military action. Sort of taking a page from the Clinton administration, and that is that during the period when we were trying to enforce no-fly zones and ascertain whether Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction, we did force the international Saddam Hussein to accept the international weapons inspectors. And now we have an instance in which Syria, whether it's candid, whether it's misrepresenting, is inviting, with the assistance or the support of the Russians, these international inspectors. Well, you could use that cudgel of military force. It still is going to take us time to assemble the necessary systems to deliver this massive punch, and use that to force Syria to move forward and accept the presence of WHO or the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons as sort of an appropriate an interim response. And if there's failure, then everything's off the table, military action.
All right, I want to put that to Awa Damon, who knows the situation in Syria well. Awa, what do you make of that idea put forward by the general of using a combination of military and diplomatic efforts to respond to this suspected chemical attack?
You know, I think it would probably depend on how far that military effort was willing to go and who exactly was leading the charge on it. Yes, there is a very, very valid argument to be made for the need for both at this stage, Aisha, but when you look at the dynamics that exist in Syria, is the situation there at a point where that would actually then down the road result in some sort of longer lasting ceasefire, eventually some sort of end to the warfare, or is that just prolonging the inevitable? Because to a certain degree, we have seen this before. We have seen certain inspectors going into Syria after the red line was crossed years ago, the one that Obama laid down in the sand. Syria did allow weapons inspectors to go, and there was all sorts of activity taking place. And then look at where we are today. So are we just going to be watching history repeat itself, or will there be something else on the table this time around that is going to actually ensure not only that these chemical weapon sites are inspected and that Syria's chemical weapons stockpile is actually put out of commission, but more importantly, when you talk to people in the areas that are being bombarded, is something going to actually happen to stop these bombings from taking place? Because yes, we see this massive outrage when it's a chemical weapon, but let's keep in mind that on a fairly regular basis, people are dying because of barrel bombs, because of artillery strikes, because of various other ordnance that is being dropped on them. So any sort of effort moving forward, whether it's going to combine military and diplomacy, is also going to have to somehow stop these airstrikes, stop this violence from taking place. Otherwise, we're just going to be seeing these cycles repeating themselves over and over again.
Oh, a very, very, very good point. Jill, final word to you. From the Russian perspective, I mean, if this does happen, if there are these military strikes, I mean, effectively, does the relationship between the U.S. and Russia basically get to the point of no return? I mean, is this, in Russia's case, would this be a red line?
Well, I mean, if you had military action, Russia against the United States, that would be extremely serious. So, and that's a possibility, even by mistake. Something can happen in the midst of some type of conflict. So that's very, very frightening. But I think right now the writing is on the wall that this is going to get deeper and deeper. And where it ends is kind of unclear. Neither side wants nuclear war, certainly, but I can tell you that I was in Moscow not long ago, just a few weeks ago, and the mood is very dark, and there is talk about war. There actually is talk even about nuclear war. So that is something to keep in mind. Now, of course, some of that it consolidates the Russian people and makes them support the government. There is that factor, but I think there is genuine fear literally about nuclear war. And when you get to that level, it becomes almost irrational. And neither side is really talking to the other, by the way. There are very few channels of real communication right now between Russia and the United States on many levels. And so that is also very dangerous.
Yeah, it is very, very dangerous. Jill Doherty there in Seattle, our Damon joining us there from Istanbul, Turkey, and General Mark McCarley here in Los Angeles. We thank you for the really great conversation, great perspective. Thank you. Let's pause here and take a very quick break. Next on Newsroom LA, the current U.S. president once called broadcasting military plans ahead of time foolish and dopey. So why is he doing it now?